So let me first introduce the terminology. A moment ago, at the very start, we took this Saussurean distinction between langue and parole. There is another Saussurean distinction that is just as well known, and that is the distinction between, okay, tell me?
Signifiant, signifié.
Yes! Interaction! Thank you! Signifiant and signifié. And if you have this Saussurean definition of the sign, then in principle you can look at the relationship between signifiant and signifié in two ways. If you take your form, your signifiant, and you look at the meanings, that is what we traditionally call a semasiological perspective. In lexical terms, that means looking at polysemy, basically. Traditional lexical terms, that's polysemy. If you take the other perspective, then that is an onomasiological perspective. That's a perspective where, from a structuralist point of view, you would ask the question, what different ways are there for expressing a certain meaning? It is a bit more complicated than that when you go to a usage-based model, but we'll see how that works. So from the lexical point of view, then the basic phenomenon from an onomasiological perspective is synonymy or near synonymy. So those are two complementary perspectives. Now, my general claim, in a sense, is that although they seem like mirror images, the two perspectives, an onomasiological perspective is up to a point more natural if you want to talk about usage-based language, or usage-based approaches, then a semasiological one. And that's, in a sense, the first question. Why is an onomasiological perspective crucial to meaning-based approaches? And I'm coming to that in a moment. Then, importantly, when we're going to study variation, is the question, what different forms does onomasiological salience take? Now, a word about salience. With salience, I will be referring to the preferences that would exist for a certain category rather than the other. The preference for one category rather than the other, that would be an onomasiological choice. And if one is more preferred than the other, or occurs more often, whatever, then that is the salience of the category. And I also want to say something, so that's the second step, what different forms does it take? And then there's a methodological step, but that's not going to develop that all that much. But one thing, of course, with the usage-based approach is that we are now dealing with, at least when we're studying contemporary languages, we often have too much material. We're living in a big data environment. So one question could be, how can you deal with onomasiological variation in a big data environment? But that's, let's say, that from the perspective of this set of lectures, that's only this side topic. That's not so crucial. But it does give me the opportunity to introduce the project that we're working on at the moment. And it's called Nephological Semantics. I'm sure that nobody is familiar with the term nephological. No. I won't explain yet what it has to do with the project, but nephology is the study of the shape of clouds. Okay, so you know you have these different categories of clouds, cumulus, cumulonimbus, strato, something, and so on. Well, that science, that is nephology. Okay? So there's a remote link with what we are trying to do in the project, but I'll be coming to that later on. Okay, and so for this study, it's in a sense what I'm drawing on here for the example is a long-term research program in our research group, Quantitative Lexicology and Variation in Linguistics, where we'll try to look precisely at language as social categorization. And some of these books were already mentioned in the introduction. So the examples and so on basically come from this tradition. Okay, maybe to recapitulate what I already mentioned in the introduction, a cognitive linguistic approach, and more broadly a post-Chomskyan cognitive functional approach would believe in language as categorization and construal. That's the central position of meaning in the study of language. Believes in language as socially and culturally variable, and you want to take that along in your description. And language as a usage-based phenomenon. And you can now argue, so remember that I wanted to ask this question, motivational question, why is an onomasiological perspective crucial? Well, if you take these features of post-Chomskyan, non-formal, etc. approaches, then you can say, for each of them, you can see that it's quite relevant to take an onomasiological perspective. In what sense? Well, first you can say if a meaning-based approach is about categorization through language, then an onomasiological perspective is the most natural one, because categorization takes the form of making onomasiological choices. Why is this? What is it, by the way? It's a bottle, but it's a water bottle, or it's an object, or it's a vessel, or it's a recipient. I have lots of categorical choices. And what I do in language use is precisely to choose one of those forms of construal, forms of identifying this thing from a certain conceptual point of view. So, and that is the way in which I create meaning. So if language is about creating meaning, then it takes the form of onomasiological choices. Of course, I have to add something to that. This is very much looking at language from the point of view of language production as the recipient, the receiver of the message. You have to perform a semasiological activity. You have to say, okay, he uses the term bottle. Why does he use the term bottle? Oh yeah, it's a bottle. But that is that correct? Can he say that it is a bottle? Oh yeah, as far as I know bottles, that's a bottle. But that of course is a semasiological activity. But the primary thing is of course the production, and the production takes the form of onomasiological choices. So, construal as a core concept of cognitive linguistics and more broadly meaning-based approaches is a matter of onomasiological choice. Okay, then onomasiological salience, I already mentioned that. That's the relative frequency with which onomasiological choices are made. Then the second thing, so I'm going back here. So language as categorization and construal, we can see that that is basically about onomasiological Language as socially and culturally variable. Well, if the approach that we're looking at is recontextualizing in the way in which I described it, and a recontextualizing approach that specifically also includes a social perspective. Remember the top left corner of the figure. Then lectal, cultural, historical differences will precisely take the form of differences of onomasiological salience. From the point of view of meaning, how do you distinguish between different language varieties? Well, you distinguish them because they make different, or have different preferences for construal specifics. And then the usage-based aspect. So if cognitive linguistics approach is a meaning, is usage-based, sorry, then an onomasiological perspective, oh yeah, this is a difficult one. Then an onomasiological perspective is necessary to avoid a regression to infinity of the concept of entrenchment. This refers to, let me first explain what entrenchment is. The notion of a usage-based model of language was, among other people, introduced by Ron Lanaker, the American linguist Ron Lanaker. And he did so by talking, among other things, he did so by talking about the entrenchment of, let's say, categories or constructions. And the idea is that when you use a certain category or a construction more often, then it becomes more important in the grammar, in your individual grammar or in the collective grammar. That is, so you can, in a sense, you could say that's an answer to the question, how do languages change? How do linguistic systems change? Linguistic systems change because certain forms of expression become more frequent. And that process, of becoming more frequent anchors them, entrenches them in the language system. That's entrenchment. And that is a way of thinking about the relationship between usage and system. You start using something, and if you use it long enough, it's part of the system. That's, in a sense, it's the same thing that from a different point of view, you could, for instance, from a purely lexical point of view, you can think of as conventionalization. Okay? You have new expressions, and new expressions at one point become conventional, which happens because they acquire a higher frequency. They become more and more frequent. That's what Lanaker was referring to by using this concept entrenchment. In terminology that I used a moment ago, you could say that's a growing salience, but also a growing salience that gives the construction in question a more firm position, for instance, in the individual knowledge. Okay? But if you think about that, you get a problem, because you would get an infinite regression. Because the idea is this: something is used with a certain frequency, and that frequency entrenches the construction or category in, for instance, in an individual language user's mind, or in the group of language users. They become more familiar with it. And because they are becoming more familiar with it, they start using it more. But then, of course, if they start using it more, it gets entrenched even more. And if it gets entrenched even more, they will start using it even more and more. And so on, and so on, and so on. And that would mean logically speaking, that the process of entrenchment would lead to an infinite entrenchment. More frequency, higher entrenchment, more frequency, higher entrenchment. You can only get away from that problem if you see that the higher frequency is basically a higher frequency in relation to alternatives. And that's also how language change happens. It's change with regards to existing ways of dealing with things. So from the point of view of usage and the relationship, if you wish, the feedback loop from usage to system, which is what entrenchment is about, it's also very relevant to take it on a massiological perspective, because otherwise you get into conceptual problems. Yeah?
And does this imply that, well, we need to have at least two competitive ways to express something so that we could speak of entrenchment like that?
Yes, that's...
If we need something relative, then we have...
Yeah. That's the way I will be talking about it. Of course, it is, if you think about it even more, it is of course even more complicated than that, because you would also want to take into account the, let's call that the referential frequency of things, or the experiential frequency. It's not just the language frequency that is important, but it's also, in the example, how often you come across bottles, okay, and that's an experiential thing, that's not a linguistic thing, and precisely how to. I don't think we have any good models yet on precisely how to combine experiential frequency and linguistic frequency and entrenchment. It's a valid question in general. I at least I don't have a very good model for that, and. One of the difficulties is that it's so difficult to measure experiential frequency. I mean, that would imply a model of the world and not just a model of language. And that's, of course, quite difficult to achieve. Okay, so there are a number of reasons for taking an onomasiological perspective if you do. I mentioned that already. So, let's now have a look. I think we can get the basic message. We have a break at 12:30, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So, I think we can get some essentials done just before the break. Think of this. Think of this type of, what is that? Yeah, okay, there is already a term there, but you recognize that type of trousers, right? You've seen that. I don't know where you may have seen it, but you must have seen it somewhere in a historical context or wherever, or maybe when some of you go hunting at it. God knows. There's a term for that, and one of the traditional terms is breeches in English, and you can give a definition for that. Breeches are trousers ending just below the knee. That's the type of lexicographical definition that you would come across. Now notice that you have three things here, and in that sense this relates directly to the question a moment ago. You have the formal layer, you have the expression, you have the conceptual layer, the concept, the meaning, the sense, the definition, and then you have the denotational or the referential layer, the actual thing. Now notice that the same thing could also, onomasiologically, be talked about in a different way. Oh no. Yeah. Onomasiologically in a different way, sorry. Because one synonym that exists for breeches is knickers. You also have knickerbockers. There are a number of terms. And that, of course, is a traditional case of synonymy, in the sense that you have two expressions for the same concept. However, you could also talk about the thing in question as a pair of trousers, where trousers means a garment extending from the waist to the knee or ankle, covering each leg separately. Well, you know what trousers are. And this is, of course, also a pair of trousers, in the same way in which if you have a pair of jeans, you can identify them specifically as jeans, but you can also refer to them as trousers. That, of course, is also onomasiological alternation, variation, but of a different type than what we had a moment ago. Because we now have, if you compare knickers and breeches, that is purely formal onomasiological variation. Where if you compare trousers, let's say with breeches, then you have conceptual onomasiological variation. That's where you really take a different category. And we can fill out the schema a little bit more because it's complicated. Because trousers also have synonyms like pants, and then pants and knickers are each also polysemous because they can both also refer to underwear. Yeah? So this is, overall you have these relations, lexical relations in various directions. The crucial thing is the distinction between the two levels and the definition of onomasiology as relating to pairs of levels. What I want to show here is that, interestingly, or maybe predictably, you get the same distinction when you take a semasiological point of view. So the distinction is, going back to this thing, formal, conceptual, denotational. So that is words and concepts and reference. Okay, those are the three levels. And you can look at the relationship between words and concepts, and then between concepts and reference. And what would happen if you would do that first on the first layer? And that is what linguists have done traditionally. Well, then you have polysemy on the one hand and synonymy on the other. That's clear enough. And one thing that I should mention is very important for this recontextualizing tendency of linguistics that I talked about, is precisely also that in looking at meaning phenomena, one thing that people have started doing in the last 25 years is to take into account the third level. In traditional meaning approaches, specifically also structuralist approaches, you only look at this. You only look at polysemy and synonymy. And you don't take into account that there is another level below that, because that is considered to be a level of encyclopedic knowledge that doesn't belong to the language. So from a semantic point of view, in the first part of the talk I introduced this decontextualizing tendency by focusing on ideas of grammar and syntax in a sense. There's also a form of decontextualization in semantics, in the sense that for a long time this lower level was not taken into account. People now do take it into account, and on the semasiological semasiological field or perspective, that takes the form of what is known as prototypicality, looking at prototypicality effects. Are you familiar with that? More or less? So in general, let's say, you know, the classical example like birds, fruit, what is the typical fruit? It's culturally specific, I wouldn't know what it is in Russia. Oh, I feel at home. So it's apple, and go to other cultures and it's different. In Brazil it's totally different. I asked them in Brazil, I forget what it was, but it definitely was not the apple. It is culturally specific, so that's already an example of cultural variation. But the crucial thing here is that the typicality of the apple is situated at the denotational level. You look at the category fruit, and within the category fruit, some forms of fruit are better than others, so to speak. They're more typical than others. That is prototypicality effects, and that is here a form of semasiological salience. The apple is, semasiologically speaking, more salient than the persimmon or something like that. Okay. Now, can we fill out the schema? Yes, of course. Because in onomasiological terms, so if we go back to the figure, then the conceptual onomasiological choice is between a concept like trousers, which is more general, but which can be used to talk about this thing, and a concept like breeches, which is specific for this, but which can also be used. And choosing either of them is a form of what in general we can refer to as construal. It is a way in which the choice, the way we talk about the world, in this case the garment, is not determined by the world. It's determined by, it takes the form of a conceptual choice that language users make. So users, in a sense, if we want to be philosophical, we can say users construe the world in a certain form. Yeah? And one construal is slightly different from the other. So the term we can use here is, as a counterpart of prototypicality on the semasiological side, is construal on the onomasiological side. And then for onomasiology, we can then make the distinction between formal onomasiology and conceptual onomasiology. So that's a distinction I will be using. What I want to do is to illustrate both, and then to show how you can do variationist studies from both perspectives. Okay, that's going to be the next step. Oh yeah, there's one. Yeah, do I have one more minute? Yeah, let's do this before we have a break. Two footnotes in a sense. One footnote is I've spent quite a bit of my career showing that a systematic distinction between these three levels is sometimes difficult, and that specifically the distinction between, let's say in these terms, between polysemy and prototypicality is not always given. That there's a lot of flexibility there. So from that point of view, what I'm telling here is a simplification. Things are a bit more difficult. So I admit that the distinction between the three levels is not, or the two basic pairs of levels, is not easy. It's also not binary, it's not categorical. There is a bit of vagueness, but for expository purposes, this is helpful. Then one more thing I want to mention is a further distinction that we can make between direct and indirect conceptual onomasiology. Because if we think of onomasiology as construal, then we also have to accept that the construal is not always situated in the terms that we use directly to name things. So the example I gave was one of naming something. What is this? Pair of trousers, breeches, whatever. That's direct naming. But the conceptual perspective that you introduce through the language is sometimes embodied in peripheral elements. And that's something that you can, in a sense, easily illustrate with a popular topic these days, refugees and migrants and immigrants. Formally, you can say, okay, between refugee and displaced person, that's a formal onomasiology. Maybe there's a slight nuance, but those are near synonyms. On the other hand, if you talk about migrants as refugees, or as refugees as migrants, that's already a conceptual distinction, because the claim that a migrant is making on his or her presence in a certain country is different from the claim that a refugee is making. So if people talk about people coming into a certain country either as refugees or as migrants, that makes a distinction, or that creates a distinction on how you think about them. That's direct conceptual onomasiology. And then, of course, if you talk about, like the former British Prime Minister did at one point, if you talk about swarms of migrants, then of course you're adding something to the construal, because you'll construal the migrants as something that is, let's say, obnoxious, annoying, and of which there are too many. That's the swarm that you are, that's evoked by the notion of swarm. So if we think about onomasiology in terms of conceptual construal, then we should also take into account the indirect forms of construals. And then we get into terrain that is to some extent that of critical linguistics, critical discourse linguistics, and related approaches. So I will also be saying something about that after the break.